Might I just ask, so as you talk about, firms being very controlling with the hierarchy, the managerial structure, do you think that's become less of a case with the development in the West anyway, and we can see a lot of developing nations moving towards this sort of service economies where, the periods of time when people work are different, there's a lot less repetitive work, there's a lot less managerial emphasis and obligation and more on, consultation and the like. Do you think workplaces are becoming less controlling and, but perhaps we won't need to have such an emphasis on workplace democracy?
I'm going to have to, that's a very good question. I always start from personal experience. My personal experience is Queen's, and this has become, now this is one institution, and it's become more authoritarian in the 10 years that I've been here. Now happily we've got a head of school who's actually, he believes in the rule of law, and he is a consultatory guy, and he moves, he tries to move on the basis of consensus. He's actually an exception. Happy exception for the School of Politics. There are other schools in it, they're going to remain nameless, where they have definitely become more authoritarian. So that's just my experience at Queen's. Now, broader global political economy point. I think some workplaces have become freer, but some workplaces have become a lot less free. So I'll give you an example of Queen's. Service industry is a burgeoning industry. I've worked in the service industry, and I found, certain forms of, you have this rhetoric of, we work as teams, we're all equals, people don't refer to you as Mr. Breen anymore, it's all Keith, and we're all, and in managers, you refer to them as first name. But that is often, you've got to distinguish between cosmetics and the sociology of the workplace. Often that it's linked with that, are very highly controlling mechanisms, surveillance and so forth. Workers, to give you an example, where even, managers now think it's okay to dictate your lifestyle outside of work. Okay, so smokers can't, we don't want smokers. Drinkers? No, we don't really want drinkers, unless they drink only a certain wine at a certain time of the day. There are a whole host of men. And okay, let's talk about what your opinions about the arguments about was called flexible specialization. That we've moved past the Fordist organisation of production and of firms, which are very hierarchical. And we've moved into sort of more lean models of our organisation, where workers are invited to become members of teams and so forth. In fact, these new systems are even more effective in controlling your behaviour than the older system. Because at least in the old system you knew, right, that person is clearly a manager or a foreman or a forewoman, right? I'm a worker. There is a clear distinction between us. But now they harness you, they bring you into the team working fold, and they get you yourself to discipline yourself. There's a whole list of the whole literature criticising the flexible specialisation literature. I think my answer in short would be, I think you're right, let's not overgeneralise, and it'll depend heavily on industries, and even within certain industries there will be some workers who enjoy quite a lot of democratic rights and a lot of autonomy, and there will be a class of sub-workers who don't enjoy that. Best example that I can give is the German car industry. German car automobile industry. I know you speak to Killian about this further. There's a highly skilled engineers and craftspeople who are a minority of workers in that industry, and they have significant autonomy. They're members of works councils and so forth. But there's also quite a big number of people who have no skills, or very little skills, and they're unskilled. And these are often Turks or Greeks, Gastarbeiter, and they don't enjoy any of the things that the more skilled workers enjoy. So I think my answer would be, don't be so optimistic, but there may be some industries where there is increasing democratisation, but my experience is in the UK, and this is, I have colleagues in other universities, and they say the same thing. There's encroaching managerialism, which is weakening the voice of academics and other voices. Now, managers would say, you academics had too much power. Maybe we did. But, you know, a corrective to academics having too much power is not. It shouldn't be managers having too much power. It should be genuine equalisation of power across all the significant bodies and voices in the university. So, a good question, but, you know, that's my rambling answer to it.
Just one personally, do you think there's enough of sort of an economic argument which you could sort of offer to some workplaces at least to sort of extend workplace democracy? Because I know certainly within, just your example with Queen's, you know, if you sort of almost divide it into a structure of A, B, C, and you say, well, Queen's University is a business taking 270 million a year, and then you sort of divide it down, you go to somewhere like the hospitality sector, for example, within Queen's, and you'll maybe have a manager or someone within that who, you know, maybe will give their staff a complete bollocking for this, that, or the other. But there's no real link, there's no real vision between sort of A and B, that the manager and the actual organisation, because the manager simply thinks it's the best way of doing this thing.
Yeah.
And he's got no incentive to sort of tell his staff off.
Yeah.
And the staff below him gain utterly nothing from it, but, you know, they lose out ultimately. So you think there needs to be sort of a revisal between that kind of link, because for me it doesn't seem to be, relationships are definitely not binary anyway. They're sort of, they go a lot sort of further beyond that almost.
So your point would be that workplace democracy or democratisation could be justified by increasing productivity and efficiency within the organisation?
I think if you're going to try and sell it to some people, that might be a factor which you could use, because there are certainly people out there, I think if you look at it structurally, there are certainly people who would be more than happy to do that.
Yeah.
But the way that they've been essentially, say, you know, brought up or trained to be a manager is naturally to sort of be a bad person with people, because they think that's what has to be done when it doesn't, essentially.
I think you're touching on something really important, and it's what makes me kind of despair about my project. It really does depend upon educative cultures. A lot of people who become managers, they, you know, increasingly, I see it in Queen's, we were invited, senior lecturers and readers and professors, and if they choose, they're welcome to join, participate in this year-long course called Managing for Leadership or Leadership for Management, where they train you to be managers. Of course, they train you into a particular ethos of management. And I think the battle has been lost at that level. And speaking to people who are sensible sods and who do work in business schools, and they're the minority of sensible sods in business schools, what they're really interested in is how the management cultures and management assumptions have changed over the years, and are looking at how this impacts upon organisations. And former president of UCU in Queen's, Rini Prendergast, do you know her? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's great, and she's really good on a history of management. And her major critique of Queen's, sorry, I'm in trouble. That goes on YouTube.
We can edit it.
Yeah, give a shit, put it up there. Her major critique of Queen's is that a certain management style has won out, and in many management schools, it's a really outdated type of management style. It's almost like Taylorist. You know, the manager is there to tell people precisely what to do and to surveil them all the time. And I'll give you instances of how this has occurred. Several years ago, the university decided it would be good that there would be that academics would appraise each other, sort of like peer mentoring. And they would do that on an informal basis. So how is my colleague doing on the research side of things? How is he or she doing on the teaching side of things? How is he or she doing on the administration side of things? Management said, oh, this is just going to be informal, and it won't have any impact upon your career or your career progression or anything like that. Boom! 7 years down the line, it's a formal process, which is now part of career progression. And if you're deemed by your appraiser and by your head of school and by people at the centre, if you're deemed to be underperforming, they put you on what was known as performance management. It's now called capability management. This is a euphemism for you've got 6 months to buck up or you're out. So that's one sort of management style that has overtaken. Earlier, there's more soft forms of management style, which are less intrusive, less surveilling, and there's trust. That's what the type of surveillance that I've mentioned is a management style which is based upon the assumption that you cannot trust your employees, that they're sheriff bastards and they're going to try and wriggle out. They're untrustworthy and they're not going to deliver. But then you have different management styles which are based upon trust. Now, I guess people who would defend workplace democratization, yeah, they would want a trust model of management, right? But they think it's more, if you don't have workplace democracy within a firm, you are vulnerable to managers one day endorsing a trust model and another day endorsing a surveillance model of management. So to prevent that happening, you need to have basically employees, and that also includes managers, because they're also employees, right? And managers often suffer significant bullying from other managers. There was a voluntary redundancy package here in Queens 2 years ago. Do you remember that? Oh, it was big in our radar. So a lot of academics left. They just took it. It was a really good offer. But actually, the biggest group who left were administrators. We're sick of it. We're sick of managers shitting on them as managers. So it's not just a simple manager-worker contrast. It's also manager-manager. It's any relationship within an organisation where you can have domination. And I've had a bad experience with managers here, but some of my worst experiences in Queens have been with colleagues, with academic colleagues. So it's ensuring protection of all interests. And the only way we can do that is through genuine democratisation. Yeah.
Well, could I ask another? Has that been greedy?
Does anyone else want to ask a question?
Well, do you think there's a bit of an assumption behind these academics that perhaps all educated workers are actually unsatisfied with sort of very straightforward managerial worker relationship? Do you think that perhaps there's actually quite a significant portion of workers who are happy with the current state of affairs, or at least unwilling to enter into but they're not interested in work-based democracy?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the reasons why Queen's and other universities, Exeter, Edinburgh, so forth, ones that I know of, have become, one of the reasons they've become more authoritarian, more surveillance type of management, which irks everybody, is that academics haven't fought it. The people who I blame most for the current cultures that you have in UK universities, academics. We're notoriously individualistic bunch of people. Okay? Look, my wife is a psychologist, and she did a bit of industrial psychology, and she's very much interested in psychopathology and psychopaths and sociopaths. And there's certain professions which have a higher proportion of sociopaths than the average population. And academia, lawyers have a higher level of sociopaths. People who are just really, they have all the classic signs. They lie, they don't care about other people, they're extremely ambitious. Not all academics are like that, but we are very career-minded, and when we see an opportunity to get ahead, we take that opportunity. Not all academics are like that, but there is that element there. There's also, I think there was complacency on the part of academics. They didn't see it coming. And I speak to colleagues who are here a lot longer than me, like Vincent Kyoga. He won't mind me mentioning him. When he tells me his experience when he's a young academic in the 70s, he said, "Man, UK academia was just totally different. It speaks of it almost like Valhalla or something, Shangri-La." But here's another reason where I think people don't resist it. We've new colleagues just joined us this year. They're really decent people. They're lovely people, and they were like me 10 years ago. I didn't know anything different. Okay? So when you first begin in a job, you assume that the way it's organised is the natural way for it to be organised, and you internalise it. And part of this goes way beyond the workplace. Part of the success of any political strategy is to get people to believe that the thing that you propose is normal, is natural, and so forth. So if you're brought up in a system, if you enter a system and you think everything is as it ought to be because you don't know anything different, well then you're going to perpetuate that system. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
I think maybe in a sector where there are a lot of sort of like tendency to be an individual.
Yeah.
But do you think it's fair to say that everyone ought to be active in sort of self-direction in the workplace?
Right.
When really they may be quite happy with
I would
maintaining the status quo.
Right. So basically, I could be guilty of slipping into sort of illiberal imposition of a particular worldview on people.
Ironically, I think.
Right. Okay. My response would be to you're worrying too much. Within there is scope within a workplace democratic regime for people who just don't really give a shit about it, who don't care about it. Like within our current political democracy, we don't force people to vote. We don't force them to be politically active. However, on the political level, there is the opportunity for you as a citizen to be politically active. The problem with authoritarian workplaces, you are denied the opportunity as an employee to be self-determining and so forth. So I would want to avoid the Rousseauian problem of forcing people to be workplace democrats, right? But I would like to allow them the substantive opportunity to avail of self-determination, autonomy, and so forth within the workplace. So I think that might address you. It's a good question. I think it might address you.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a good question because I don't want to turn everybody into sort of like somebody who goes for the SU, really sort of really active politically. They're lovely people, but can you imagine if everybody was like that? It'd be awful. Yeah, I mean, it's, you need them. Okay. So.
Any other questions or anything else?
I think theoretically it sounds very, very interesting, but practically, if we were comparing it to normal democracy, where we have a population and then only certain members take part and it ends up being quite populist, what happens in a situation where you have workplace democracy and sort of what's best for the company, maybe what's best for society is the common good, it's what's best for the workers?
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Or even when you were saying earlier, and I think this isn't what you meant, but when you were talking about lecturers, but they get sort of pushed on the programme if they're underperforming according to their thing, there has to be a way to deal with that.
Yeah.
Because they're can't be instances, obviously, it's their lecturers or whatever.
Yeah.
And there can't be instances for employees, but employees aren't necessarily incentivised properly to deal with that themselves.
Yeah. I think my answer to your first point about workers' interest just being one interest, and that there are other interests in society which are just as significant, and that those interests have got to be paid attention to. I view workplace democracy a bit like how you might view democracy on the local democracy on the level of a village or a town. Look, if you think, you can have genuine local democracy, but if people always just acted on their local interests, that's wrong. And Burke is right. The point about the good representative acts upon the basis of the interest of society as a whole. So I think ideally there would have to be fora, and I haven't worked these out, and these have to be worked out, where other interests would feed into workplace democracy. So stakeholders, and lots of stakeholders, not just shareholders. That's very narrow, right? Not just shareholders. It would have to be local communities, environmental groups, people concerned about affordable energy, whatever. All these groups would have to get a voice in. And also, democracy at the workplace level does not trump democracy at the political level. That actually trumps democracy. So if the citizens decide that there is new labour legislation, that trumps democracy at the workplace. You know, so I think that would be my first response. My second response would be, I think you're right. I mean, I know a lot of shit lecturers, and they really are crap. Crap on several levels. So they can't lecture, they're shit researchers. And what really disturbs me, because I do a lot of admin in the school, they're really bad at doing admin tasks, and they make my work even more difficult. I'm not naming anybody, but there are people. You have them everywhere, right? Yeah, I think they should be disciplined. I think they should be told to buck up. But the problem with authoritarian workplaces, you're just, one day there's one system, the next day there's another system, and you don't have significant input in it. There isn't the incentive for higher up managers to give you that input. And you might have, I think, a lot of the stuff that worries me about Queen's, I would be happy with it if I had some significant input in it, and that's the only way to ensure it. So your two points. Firstly, it's not just worker interests. Secondly, all people have an interest in ensuring some sort of quality in the university. I totally agree with you on those ones. So good points. But it's still compatible with workplace law.
Yeah, it's still, yeah.
One more?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I sort of want to add a little caveat before I ask the question, which is that I am, to Adam's discussed, a committed socialist, so I like hearing, I enjoyed hearing everything else, so I'm sort of just playing devil's advocate here. But do you not think there's maybe potentially a conflation between arbitrariness from a manager and just response to kind of market conditions? So there could be an argument there's a bit of a category error with the whole idea of workplace democracy, because the state can afford to be inefficient because it's a level playing field, but companies can't afford to be inefficient because they're competing with other companies. And so they're not being arbitrary to try and oppress their workers in some way, but they're being, on the surface they seem arbitrary, but actually they're just responding to market conditions. And actually you should let them get on with it, because potentially it's better to maybe have a couple of dissatisfied workers than a whole company that employs dozens of people goes out of business.
I see where you're coming from, yeah. So relocating a factory may not be because of an arbitrary decision.
Yeah.
In genuine cases where, look, the company's going to go under unless, because we've got these competitors who have already relocated, I can see that. But often the argument isn't that they're going to go under. That's the argument that's often made. It's just that it's about profitability.
Okay.
So I think that's right. I think those decisions would be a lot more palatable for workers if they were part of the decision-making process. If they were included. I used to see it all the time where, workers, they know that there's been difficulties, but they turn up, and they've known that for maybe 3 or 4 months that the company's in difficulty, but then turn up some Monday morning for a meeting with management, and management says, look, we're relocating, you're all being made redundant. If they were part of the decision, this is reality. I disagree with your point about the state being able to have more scope for inefficiency than firms, because if you take the global order is actually, it's a cutthroat order currently, and states are also driven by economic imperatives. But I agree with your point. I don't think that would undermine workplace democracy. I actually think in some ways that's an argument for greater inclusion of workers in the decision-making process. And we could come up with some sort of solutions to these problems. I know when Waterford Crystal began as, they fucked it up, the workers, for a number of reasons. But when it initially closed, they had the option of buying out the company, and they bought out the company. And they said they were trading successfully for a while, but one of the mistakes that they made was that they gave themselves too much money. And that was silly to work as a cooperative like that. But then you have other examples of, one of the examples is, it's great in theory, but in practice, give me an example of a workplace democracy at work. Well, I can give you a very successful example of it from Europe. It's called the Mondragon Corporation. It's based in the Basque Country. It employs, or it doesn't employ anybody. It's got 80,000 worker owners. It's a democratic firm. It has its own university, so it educates each generation of managers into its own ethos. Has its own bank to fund cooperatives. So it's a conglomeration of cooperatives. That's a very, very successful workplace firm, which is defined by workplace democracy. And it's thriving now in Spain, where the rest of Spain is in shit. So that just shows, one of the reasons why it's able to thrive and become more effective is that in difficult times, workers can themselves decide to reduce their pay and so forth. And that's what they've done in Mondragon. But I take the point, there are certain situations where decisions have to be made, are deeply unpalatable to workers. That's life. Yes? Sure.
Is there time for more questions?
I got 5 minutes, then I gotta go collect my kids.
Right, quick.
Okay, so the state is the largest employer in the country. Now, would it be possible to have workplace democracy in an institution which is already supposed to be governed by representation and democracy? Would it be fair that workers in the civil service have sort of democratic power, sizing up?
This is where it gets complex, because they're civil servants. They're there to serve the decisions made by our representatives. That's ideally.
Yes.
Sometimes the relation works the other way around.
Yeah.
I think there should be some sort of democratization for certain issues. So how people's work is regulated, working conditions, maybe about where they're located physically. Now, something like this, in the Republic, suddenly the government, I forget which government it was, suddenly overnight decided, oh my God, everything's concentrated in Dublin. Let's start putting parts of the civil service in different places. So, car licensing. Let's have that in Letterkenny. Right? You know where Letterkenny is? I don't fucking know. It's a crazy idea. It's taking ages to get there. I think on those decisions, maybe you should have democracy. But it's the nature of those bureaucracies that, on other decisions, they have to follow the decisions of representatives. And it gets really tricky when you come to the military. Should the military be democratized? And I'm not too sure about that. And there's other companies that I think there might be arguments for not democratizing. Companies which are defined by a specific ethos. I know you've all drunk this at some time. Buckfast. Buckfast is made by monks, isn't it? And they I forget, is it Benedictines or something like that? And they have their own, it's a very hierarchical order. But it's also a company. But I would think it might be illiberal to enforce workplace democracy on them, because they're defined by a particular ethos, which is not democratic. Also, I'm worried about, because I come from a petty bourgeois background, so small business. I'm worried about imposing workplace democracy on sole proprietors. There may be people who generally want to be Stalins in their own workplace, and I think that's fine if it's a sole ownership type of situation. But I think so. So certain companies, I think, will need to exempt them on liberty grounds from the demand for workplace democracy. But I think the threshold is when they start employing people. That's where workplace democracy should kick in. Because employing people means that you get to use the labour. It doesn't mean that you're permitted to become their dictator. There's a difference between hiring labour and controlling labour. But anyhow, that's a topic for another paper, I think.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you very much.